we're human. But we have an example of faithfulness in God himself. Our God is faithful. We may not always understand his faithfulness. We may at times look at him and say, well, why did you do this? And why did you do that? And why did you let that happen? Why did you let a hurricane hit South Florida? And we don't understand what he's doing. But he says all things work to his glory. And he loves us, and he says, and all things eventually work to what's best for you. Now, as I'm comforting a family over the loss of a father with little kids in the family, it's hard to look at them and say, all things work to what's best for you. That's tough. And trusting God that he knows what we're doing in those times of tragedy are tough. But God is faithful, even in the darkest hours. So as you find Daniel, we're going to be talking about faithfulness and how God is faithful in all that he does, even when we do not understand it. So Daniel 6 is a story that we all know. Pastor, why are you doing something? We already know all this. We've heard this since we were little kids. Yes, what we're going to do is be looking at it in a little bit different light. We're looking at it from the point of faithfulness. Okay? So in Daniel 6, he is talking about the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps. Let me take a minute on satraps. Satraps are governors over a region. Okay? So he had 120 regions in the empire, and he had set governors over all those regions. And you can imagine if the king had to call each one of those governors one at a time to come up and give a report, he'd spend all this time talking to all these satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 governors, whom Daniel was one. So instead of having to talk to all 120 of these satraps, these little governors, he set 3 governors over all them. He split it up. And he says, okay, you take so many, and you take so many, and you take so many. You get their reports, and just the 3, you come talk to me. A lot more manageable. Darius was not a dumb king. They may give account to them so that the king would suffer no loss. So these reports that came up showed how the revenue, the crops, all the things that were happening. Now you've got to remember, this empire is huge. It stretches all the way from Europe over to the Middle East. So it's a big area that he's having to control. So he's found a way to do this in a way that he's only got to talk to a few people to find out what's going on in the kingdom. Because all those people answer to these 3 people, of which Daniel was one. Then, this Daniel, I love that how they say it, this Daniel, distinguished himself above the governors and the satraps and became an excellent spirit that was in him, and the king gave thought to set him over the whole realm. So Daniel, because of the Spirit of God that was in him, was smarter than these other guys. And now, you got to remember, this isn't Daniel's first inning with the king. When he was a young man, he dealt with the king, and that king passed on, and then there was the next king, and the next king. He continued all the way to Cyrus. So this is in that middle. Now, understanding these kingdoms and what's going on in this kingdom here, okay, this is that period between when Babylon was strong and when the Persians took over. There was a middle period in there that Cyrus took over as king. So the governors and the satraps sought to find a way to charge against Daniel. You know, isn't that always the way? When you achieve something and you're doing a good job, the people underneath you want to cut your legs out from underneath you. They're looking for a way to cut him down in front of the king. Against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could not find any charge or fault. There was nothing wrong. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was being a good servant because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So where are they going to attack him? Okay, his walk with his God. Isn't that the way the world does it? They can't get you any other way. Let's come up with this whole thing, oh, he serves God, let's find a way to get him over that. So these governors and satraps thronged, I love that, came together in a big group, kind of surrounded the king, before the king, and said to him, King Darius, live forever. And that's a good thing to say to a king, right? You hear it a lot. All the governors of the kingdom and all the administrators and satraps and the counselors and the advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree so that whatever petition or any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den. In other words, you can't pray, you can't ask anybody else, you've got to do it before the king, is what they're saying. They knew what they were doing. They were setting a trap here. Isn't it how funny how the world sets traps for you? It's happening all over our country today. They're setting traps. One of the things that's happening is they'll send somebody into your congregation to listen to your sermon and take your sermon and then turn around and try to use it against you. Okay? Let me go back. O king shall be cast into a lion's den. So they're not just saying, if they do something wrong here, we're going to put them in jail. No, we're going to kill them, because when you're cast into the lion's den, that is a death sentence. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. You hear what's happening here? They're setting the decree. Okay? Our Congress sets decrees. And if you don't follow their decree, then you're going to end up with fine, jail, sentence to death, whatever, on these decrees. That's what's going on here. These guys are taking the place of the Congress before the king, saying, hey, we want this new rule to be put in there. It happened this week. A new rule was put in by our state senators. And it's a Senate bill. And it says, unless you buy drones from these companies, then they're not allowed to be used by any government agency. Okay? You got to buy from these companies here. Now, we haven't got into all the legal everything, but sometimes we make decrees, and the person making the decree, they don't really understand the full impact of that decree. So when it comes down to me, I run a little drone racing team with kids. We fly these little drones inside of a building. If we follow that decree to the letter, I have to shut down the drone racing team. Second part of that is if you look at the 6 companies they say you got to buy from, they don't make drones that we would use for doing drone racing with kids. They're industrial, commercial drones. So sometimes we put things down there and we haven't looked at everything that it can impact before we sign it as a rule. And that's what was going on here. This king didn't mean to sign something that was going to attack one of his top people, but he signed it. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, hear it again, that Daniel, who is one of the captives of Judah, does not show due regard. Okay? what they're going to do down here? Therefore, King Darius signed a written decree. Now, then Daniel knew that the writing was signed, and he went home and went to his upper room with the window open towards Jerusalem. He didn't go hide. Hear that? He didn't go hide. He went home and opened his window where people can see him inside there. He knew what the decree said. He knew what could happen to him. He made a decision for God rather than for man. He opened his windows towards Jerusalem, and he knelt down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God, as it was his custom since his early days. This wasn't something new. He always had done that. He had always gone 3 times a day and prayed to God. He had a routine. Yeah, that should set something for some people. You need to have a routine to go to God. Mine's in the morning. I try to get more in the daytime, but at least in the morning I'm going to spend my time, whether it's reading the book or praying or whatever. Daniel had a set time. It wasn't something new. It wasn't something different. He was just doing what he always did, honoring God. And these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplications before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning to the king's decree. Have you, now look how they trapped the king. Have you not signed a decree that every man who makes a petition to any god or man within 30 days is set for you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den? You know what the king's thinking right now?
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Thank you. Uh-oh. I messed up. I did something I didn't intend to do. You know, a lot of times we do things that we don't intend because we don't look at what the whole outcome may be. He didn't intend this. He liked Daniel. The king answered and said, the thing is true according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives of Judah, does not show due regard to you, O king, for the decrees that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king went when he heard these words and was greatly displeased with who? With himself. He wasn't mad at somebody else. These guys were, this is a king's court. There's always somebody trying to come up with something. He was mad at himself that he didn't catch what they were trying to do. Mad with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored until the going down of the sun to deliver him. Hear that? There was genuine concern here by the king for Daniel. Daniel's the same one that had been in Babylon and had told the king what was going to happen to him. He knew the stories. He knew how valuable Daniel was, especially in his new kingdom. These men approached the king and said to him, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree nor statute which the king established may be changed. So the king gave commandment. He had been trapped. He had no recourse. He couldn't change the law. It was set in stone. He had to go forward. So the king gave commandment, and they brought Daniel, and they cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, here's where some faith, little bit of faith is from the king. Here's a little faith. You see, this king had watched Daniel with the previous kings and all the great things that Daniel had done, and how Daniel's friend Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been delivered from the fire and the flames. He knew the stories, and he knew about Daniel. Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. That had some small measure of belief by the king. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring. That was a thing of the time. You would take your ring, your signet ring, and they would put a seal of wax on there, and you would stick your ring in it, and if anybody messed with that and broke that seal, that was a crime against the crown. So Daniel's in there, and nobody can do anything about it. And with the sickness of the Lord's that had purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. So the king sealed it, and then he had all those guys that had charged Daniel to seal it with him. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night doing what? Fasting. Okay? This is an unusual thing for a king to do, because usually there's a banquet every night for the king. He spent the night fasting. He ran off the musicians that were brought before him. Also, his sleep went from him. He had a sleepless night worrying about Daniel. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the lion's den. Hear this? There's concern here. There's hope here. And when he came to the den, he cried out in a lamented voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Hear that? He didn't just say it, he said it in a laminating, what you would do at a funeral. He assumed Daniel's dead. That was his assumption. But in hope, he cried out. Hear what Daniel says to him. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. I didn't do anything. I was innocent, and I was put in here by wicked men. Now the king was exceedingly glad of him, and commanded that they should take up Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he believed in his God. God is faithful. Even in our darkest hour, even when they were taking Daniel and they were throwing him in the pit, God was faithful. Sometimes things are bleak and they're dark, and we're facing things that we assume we're not going to make it out of this. Jesus said, be faithful unto death, and I will give you life. Daniel was faithful unto death. When he was cast in his pit, Daniel in his mind said, this is probably it. But God was faithful to his servant who loved him and who served him and who took care of him. And the king gave command, and they brought those who had accused Daniel and cast them into the den. Why did he do that, do you think? And why is that put in the Bible? They want you to see that this wasn't some apparition. This wasn't some lions that just weren't hungry. Threw them into the den of lions. Them, their children, and their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones into pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. People need to be careful when they attack the children of God.
Amen.
Because God loves his children, and God will take care of his children. And sometimes things don't go so good for the other people. Not always. Then King Darius wrote to all the people of the nations of the languages that dwelled in the earth, peace. And when they say the earth, as far as he is concerned, his kingdom was the whole earth. Peace be multiplied to you I make a decree that every dominion of my kingdom, that men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Here is a man who doesn't believe in God, who has just been shown the power of the true God. And he's telling all his people, he didn't say turn to God, he said fear Daniel's God. For he is the living God, and is steadfast forever, and his kingdom is one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in the heaven and earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Folks, that is faithfulness. You had two things going on there. You had Daniel being totally faithful. As Jesus said, unto death. He didn't care that it was going to cost him his life. He was going to get on his knees 3 times a day like he had always done in front of the whole town, and he was going to pray, even if they threw him to the lions. Daniel was not ignorant of what could happen to him. He knew what the decree was. But he chose to be faithful. And God honored his faithfulness. And God took care of him. And Daniel was promoted to the highest person below the king in the kingdom. I want to thank you for joining us here at Frontenac Baptist Church in Cocoa, Florida. I hope you received a blessing from this Daniel story. I want to thank you once again for joining us here at Frontenac Baptist Church.